So Jonathan Edwards was a pastor, he was a preacher, he was a writer, he was a theologian, he was a missionary, and he's considered by many to be the greatest intellect that America has ever produced. He was a central figure in the Great Awakening, and despite all this, a lot of folks don't really have a great understanding of who Jonathan Edwards was beyond maybe one of the famous sermons that he preached. So let's talk about the life and ministry of Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards lived from 1703 to 1758. He's a central figure in what is known as the Great Awakening. B.B. Warfield said that Jonathan Edwards, saint and metaphysician, revivalist and theologian, stands out as one figure of real greatness in the intellectual life of colonial America. And the phrase colonial America is important for the context here. He's born October 5th, 1703 in Connecticut, but this is a colony. He's born in the 13 colonies. This is decades before the Revolutionary War would take place, and so he is a British citizen. He's living in the colonies in America, but this is long before the United States was a thing. He wouldn't even know what you were talking about if you mentioned the United States to him. And also keep in mind, we're talking really early days in the history of the 13 colonies. The entire population of all the 13 colonies settlers combined was about 250,000. So this is really early on. And Jonathan Edwards is born the fifth of 11 children. He's the only son. He has 10 sisters. And his father, Timothy, was a minister. His maternal grandfather was the famous Solomon Stoddard. And he ministered for around 60 years in Northampton, Massachusetts. It's about 100 miles from Boston. And the name Solomon Stoddard is going to be really important for understanding the life and the ministry of Jonathan Edwards. And we're going to get more into him as we go on here. But by all accounts, Jonathan had a very happy childhood. He was a very intelligent child. He was intellectually gifted. He was a voracious reader. He grew up in a Puritan atmosphere. He loved to learn. He devoured books at a young age by folks like Isaac Newton and John Locke and many others. So he's a very intellectually curious child. And as a teenager, he had a bit of a scientific bent as well. He would spend hours studying a flying spider, as it was called, and he really wanted to get these observations of his published in a scientific magazine back in England. But as he's writing these observations about how this spider will sling its web into the air and catch the wind and really travel, for a spider at least, really great distances, he's not just being a detached scientist. He's always tying things back to God and his creation. He writes this: "We hence see the exuberant goodness of the Creator, who hath not only provided for all the necessities, but also for the pleasure and recreation of all sorts of creatures, and even the insects and those that are most despicable." If you're like me, spiders are indeed despicable, but he sees this spider doing what God created him to do, and he sees that God has given even the despicable, lowly spider this element of pleasure in its life as it travels through the forest to spread its despicable little creature children. Edwards observes the life of this spider and its habits and its practices here, and he sees that God has given this amount of pleasure even to a lowly insect. And that's the kind of mind that Edwards had. Now, by the age of 13, he enters what was known as the collegiate school. Soon that would become known as Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. And this was founded just 2 years before he was born. Now that might sound extremely remarkable that a 13-year-old is entering Yale, and it is, but not maybe as remarkable as it would be today. The average student at Yale at that time was about 15 or 16 years old, so Edwards might be entering a little bit early, but it's not the same as a 13-year-old getting accepted into Yale in our day. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is Yale was founded as a religious school. Listen to this founding statement in its charter in 1701. It was created to be an institution wherein youth may be instructed in the arts and sciences, and through the blessing of Almighty God may be fitted for public employment both in church and civil state. So it's a very different situation, and it's a very different Yale than it is today. It was quite a bit smaller, additionally. There had been about 100 students, and again, many of them 15, 16 years old. And this is an environment that Jonathan Edwards has not been a part of. And so he doesn't really take place in a lot of the goofing around and the sinfulness that's happening around him. But he's a very good student, as you would expect from someone with Jonathan Edwards' intellect. And he would go on to graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in 1720, but he wouldn't finish up there. He would continue for a couple more years until he got his Master of Arts degree in 1723. And it's during these Yale years that Jonathan Edwards experiences conversion. Now, Jonathan Edwards doesn't have a radical conversion story like you might read about in the life of John Newton, for example, the famous slave trader turned Christian, preacher, writer of the hymn Amazing Grace. Rather, Jonathan Edwards grew up in this Puritan environment. He was the son of a minister. He was the grandson of a minister. So he's always kind of steeped in a Christian environment, and yet he really does experience a conversion story later in his years. This takes place in 1721, and he's reading 1 Timothy 1:17. And as he does so, he reflects on who God is and his relationship to him through Jesus Christ. And he writes this later. He says, "The first instance that I remember of the sort of inward, sweet delight in God and divine things that I have lived much in since was on reading those words, 'Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, the honor and glory forever and ever. Amen.' As I read those words, there came into my soul and was, as it were, diffused through it a sense of the glory of the divine being, a new sense, quite different from anything I ever experienced before." So that takes place during these years at Yale, and prior to completing his studies, Edwards actually holds a brief pastorate at First Presbyterian Church in New York. He's only 19 years old. He doesn't serve there very long. And it was during this time that he completed his resolutions. If you ever come across the resolutions of Jonathan Edwards, this is when he wrote those. These are 70 resolutions that he wrote down to really try to focus his life in service of the Lord. And it was his intent to read over these weekly to kind of gauge how he was doing in his process of sanctification. So just for a taste of those, resolution number 1 is, I will serve God. And resolution number 2 is, if nobody else does, I still will. And so that's the sort of thing that you can find in Jonathan Edwards' resolutions. I encourage you to check those out. They're really interesting, and they're really convicting and encouraging as you try to live your life for Christ. Well, after completing his studies, he serves as a tutor at Yale for a couple years, but then his pastorate begins. In 1726, he's called to serve alongside his 83-year-old grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, in Northampton. Now again, keep in mind, early 1700s, 83 is super old. He is probably well past the average lifespan, and he's been serving this church for around 60 years. And Jonathan Edwards is called to serve alongside him to be a help to him. Edwards is just 23 years old, and he's going to go on to serve that church for about 23 years. The very next year after starting to serve at Northampton, he marries 17-year-old Sarah Pierpont. Now, she would be his lifelong helper in ministry. They were a great pair. He was a very introverted person. She was a very extroverted person, was very good at hospitality and all the duties that go along with being a pastor. And they'll go on to have 3 sons and 8 daughters together. Well, on February 11, 1729, after around 60 years of serving as pastor here in Northampton, Solomon Stoddard died, and Edwards became the lead pastor to this church, and at that time it had a congregation of about 1,300 people. It was a very well-known, a very influential church. Solomon Stoddard had been a very influential part of that society. He was referred to sometimes as Pope Stoddard, and so this was a very important role that Jonathan Edwards was stepping into. Now, as we think through Jonathan Edwards' life chronologically, it's about here that we are introduced to a subject that's a difficult thing. Jonathan Edwards, for all the commendable parts of his life, we're also reminded from this time period that the best of men are men at best. Records indicate that in 1731, Edwards purchased a young enslaved girl named Venus. The Edwards household also included a young enslaved boy named Titus. Now, there's also mention of a female enslaved person named Leah, but it's not quite sure if that is a different individual than Venus. Some historians believe that they simply gave Venus a biblical name and changed it to Leah, so that's not quite certain. Now, it's important to understand that there is no historical information about how or why Edwards purchased slaves, what their life was like in his household, how he treated them. There's really no basis to be able to say and really excuse this by saying that Edwards purchased them out of a difficult situation, brought them into his household, and treated them like family. We just don't know that. We don't know what life was like in the Edwards household for these people that were slaves. We do know from his writings that Edwards saw that there was a spiritual equality between the races. And during his time as pastor, there was at least 9 African Americans, slaves, that were brought into church membership, full church membership. They were baptized, they took communion. There was also many natives that were also brought into church membership. And this included Leah, the slave in his household. So there was at least an understanding on Edwards' part that there was no spiritual difference between the free whites and the enslaved black people in the colonies at this time. He would actually write and make clear that God condescends to everybody. There's nobody worthy of God, slave or free. God actually condescends to come down and bring salvation to all people equally. And so that's one element of Edwards' complicated, history here on slavery. But in 1740, Edwards and his wife, they co-signed a legal guarantee of financial support to 2 slaves who were freed in the will of Sarah Edwards' stepmother. So they're providing financially for these freed slaves at the same time that he is actually owning people and has enslaved people in his house. At the same time, we also know a nearby town, there was a controversy going on where the congregation was really chastising its minister for owning slaves, saying that as a man of God, you ought not to do that. Edwards actually writes in defense of the minister and his right to own slaves, while at the same time condemning the barbaric Atlantic slave trade as evil, and again reiterating that there's a spiritual equality between slave and free. So a very complicated view of Edwards' ideas on slavery here. Moreover, we know that Jonathan Edwards Jr., his son, as well as some of Edwards' students, Joseph Bellamy and Samuel Hopkins, they would become staunch abolitionists. They would preach against the evils of slavery. They would write against the evils of slavery. Samuel Hopkins would go before Continental Congress and urge them to abolish slavery. And they all seemed to think that they were really working out and acting out through what they were taught by Jonathan Edwards. And there's not anything in existence in their writings that go back and condemn Edwards, that laud him for his good and the beneficial parts of his ministry, but then distance themselves from his views on slavery. They act as though they are really working out of the things that he taught in the concepts of benevolence or love towards neighbor, and taking it further than what Edwards did in his own lifetime. One indication that we see about his understanding and his really wrestling with his father's legacy on slavery is we have a sermon from Jonathan Edwards that is very anti-slavery, very abolitionist towards slavery. And he does say in a general sense that he and his hearers cannot sin on this issue so cheaply as their fathers did. And he's recognizing that they need to understand and line up their views on this contentious issue with what Scripture teaches on it. So all that to say, Jonathan Edwards is not a perfect person. And this biography of him is not intended to paint him as that, but rather we recognize that it was the reality in this time that slavery existed in the colonies, and Jonathan Edwards did, in fact, participate in that. There are also some challenges in the life of Edwards during this time. Culturally, religiously, it's a very nominal Christianity that is around. That is to say, people who are simply culturally Christian. They're Christian in name only. And in fact, many of the clergy in the colonies were not actually converted. They were not actually followers of Jesus Christ. Evangelist George Whitefield, who was also a central figure in the Great Awakening, he was a good friend of Jonathan Edwards, he wrote this: "The Lord enabled me to open my mouth boldly against unconverted ministers, for I am persuaded the generality of preachers talk of an unknown and unfelt Christ. The reason why congregations have been so dead is because they have dead men preaching to them. Oh, that the Lord may quicken and revive them. How can dead men beget living children? So Edwards is up against this nominal Christianity in his town and in his congregation. He has opposition inside the church in the form of a prominent family called the Williams family. They were very loyal to Solomon Stoddard in the way he taught and preached and his outlook on ministry and life. And so anytime Edwards was out of step with that, they let him know. And so there's all these issues going on that make it a difficult place to minister and preach. And he's also very, very busy at this time. He's preaching, he's caring for his congregation, he's visiting the sick, he's leading his family, he's lecturing elsewhere and preaching elsewhere in the area, and he's spending as many as 13 hours a day in his study, which is really remarkable. And in addition to his regular ministry, he's also writing. He's writing a lot, and he'll go on to publish many works in his lifetime, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. It's at this time period that the Great Awakening begins. Now, the Great Awakening is a really pivotal part in the history of the United States and in church history, and you really ought to understand a little bit about that. We're not going to get in depth in this video on it, but I encourage you to read more about it. But it's a period of spiritual revival that takes place in the 1730s and the 1740s. It has its beginning around 1734, 1735, cools off a little bit, and then comes back with renewed energy in 1740 and 41. So Jonathan Edwards is a central figure during the Great Awakening, along with others, George Whitefield, we already mentioned, men like John and Charles Wesley. And there's this emphasis on the true gospel, on true conversion, on the new birth, of not merely saying that you're a Christian, not merely attending church or taking communion or being baptized, but really and truly following Jesus Christ, trusting in Him alone for salvation, repenting of sin, and following after Him. This is having a massive impact on the colonies at this time. In fact, we have this from the pen of Benjamin Franklin. He wrote, "It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street." And that's from Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's a deist. He is not a Christian, and he recognizes the benefits the Great Awakening has, and he was actually a good friend and admirer of men like George Whitefield. Now, during the Great Awakening, this is when Jonathan Edwards preaches his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So if you've already heard of Jonathan Edwards, it's likely because you've come across or read this sermon. Now, he preached this sermon a couple of times, actually, once to his congregation and more famously in Enfield in 1741. And he gives this sermon on Deuteronomy 32:35, which says, "Their feet shall slip in due time." And he paints this picture trying to shake people out of their apathy. Again, he's talking to people that are nominally Christian, that show up at church faithfully week in and week out and live like everybody else the rest of the week. And they're not truly following Jesus Christ. They're going to hell if they do not trust in the Lord for salvation. So he's really trying to shake them out of their slumber. Listen to a little portion of this sermon.
You probably are not sensible of this. You find you are kept out of hell, but do not see the hand of God in it, but look at other things, as the good state of your bodily constitution, your care of your own life, and the means you use for your own preservation, but indeed, these things are nothing. If God should withdraw His hand, they would avail no more to keep you from falling than the thin air to hold up a person that is suspended in it. Your wickedness makes you, as it were, heavy as lead, and to tend downwards with great weight and pressure towards hell. And if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf. And your healthy constitution, and your own care and prudence, and your best contrivance and all your righteousness would have no more influence to uphold you and keep you out of hell than a spider's web would have to stop a falling rock.
It's very intense language. He also opened wide the gates of mercy and pointed people towards Christ. The same sermon, he also says, Christ has thrown the door of mercy wide open and stands in calling and crying with a loud voice to poor sinners. So this is a very intense sermon, but don't get the wrong impression. Jonathan Edwards was not a fire and brimstone preacher. He didn't use his arms a lot. He didn't gesticulate wildly. He didn't pound the pulpit. In fact, he often would give a very monotone reading of his sermons. And one contemporary account says that he would just stare back at the bell rope and not even really look at the faces of those he preached to. And despite that, people were greatly struck by this sermon. They wept, they shrieked, they moaned, they cried aloud. In fact, it got so loud he had to stop preaching at several points because it was too noisy with people crying out about, oh, I'm going to hell. What must I do to be saved? And many were saved as a result of that conviction that God brought on them through the use of that sermon. And this is viewed as one of the catalysts for the impact of the Great Awakening at this time. Beyond just his preaching to his own congregation and to other gatherings, Edwards becomes a leading figure in the Great Awakening because of his writings. Now, he writes a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God in the conversion of many hundred souls in Northampton, and he's giving this account of what God is doing in his church early on. Other things he writes in his lifetime and around this time, discourses on various important subjects. That's a collection of 5 of his sermons. He also writes some thoughts concerning the present revival in New England and the way it ought to be acknowledged and promoted. You see, not everyone was on board with this whole Great Awakening thing. There was a group of people, a lot of those unconverted clergy, that pushed back against it, were very skeptical of it, and tried to suppress it. They were known as the Old Lights, while Jonathan Edwards and Whitefield and the Wesleys were known as the New Lights, trying to promote the Great Awakening and the revival that was taking place. And he wrote this book in defense of that revival. Another important work along those same lines is the religious affections. Now, there was people that pushed back against the Great Awakening and what was taking place because there was a lot of emotionalism, a lot of excesses that were taking place where people were being manipulated emotionally to make responses for Jesus. And Edwards did not approve of that at all. And he writes the religious affections to help people discern between true revival and artificial revival, true conversion and artificial conversion. Because you have, of course, the parable of the sower, in which some of it, sprouts quickly, but it fades away because it does not have roots. And Edwards was helping people discern between what was real and what was not. And the book, Religious Affections, has been a helpful tool for generations since that time as revivals have come up throughout church history to try to better understand what is an actual true work of God or not. He also writes the life and diary of David Brainerd. David Brainerd was a missionary to the natives in that area, and he was friends with the Edwards family. He actually comes to live with him and ends up dying in the Edwards home. He was quite ill. He was nursed for some time by Edwards' daughter, and he ends up passing away, and he leaves his diary behind. And Jonathan Edwards takes that and publishes not only the diary, but a narrative of the life and the ministry of David Brainerd. Now, this book would have a tremendous impact on the church and future missionaries. It was the first true missionary biography. It would impact people like William Carey, Robert Murray McCheyne, David Livingston, Andrew Murray, and many others. And so it was a really important work that Edwards wrote at this time. There's other works such as Charity and Its Fruits and many other things that Edwards wrote during this time period and later in his life. And despite all of this, despite being a faithful pastor in Northampton for over 20 years, despite all these books that he's writing, despite the theological work that he's doing, despite being a major figure in the great revival that is taking place, Edwards would actually be fired from his role on June 22nd, 1750. Now, there's a few things that led up to this, some small things and then one major controversy. So a couple of the small things was requests for more money. Edwards and Sarah had 11 children, but requests for an increase in salary were not received well by many in the congregation. Folks like the Williams family would use that to try to stir up opposition against Jonathan Edwards and paint him as being greedy or materialistic, which really is far from the case. There's also an incident, what is known as the bad book case. and Edwards ran afoul with some of the parents. You see, some of the boys in the congregation had gotten hold of a book, and it was a book written for the use of midwives in helping women birth children. And as you might expect, a book of that nature has some drawings in it. And these young, immature boys would actually tease and harass some of the young girls in the congregation with this newfound information. And so Jonathan Edwards wants to put a stop to it, and after a service one day, he reads a list of names of young people he would like to stick around after the service to have a frank conversation. But what he doesn't do is make any sort of distinction between the guilty parties and the not guilty parties. And so parents of children who were not involved in this were really quite offended and upset that he implicated their children as being part of it, because everybody knew that this was happening. So those are a couple of the smaller things going on, but there's one really important element that led to Jonathan Edwards being dismissed, and that is what's known as the halfway covenant. So now remember the context. Many people that are going to church week in and week out have no profession of faith of their own, and yet they were baptized as infants of believing parents, which is what the tradition that Jonathan Edwards was a part of saw as a proper mode of baptism. But now here's a problem. They're grown up and they have children of their own. They have been baptized, they have made no profession of faith in Christ themselves, and now they want their children, their infants, to be baptized. Now, this was not a unique problem to the church that Jonathan Edwards was a part of. This was a problem in Solomon Stoddard's day, and that's why the halfway covenant came about. This was not Stoddard's idea, but he did endorse and implement this. And this was that those who had been baptized as infants, but were not converted themselves, could become partial church members and have their children baptized in the church. Solomon Stoddard actually took this further, and he would allow them to participate in communion as well, even though these parents had no profession of faith. He saw communion, or the Lord's Supper, as a saving ordinance, meaning he thought that if it was done well, it could actually draw those people to saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Jonathan Edwards is absolutely opposed to this. He does not like the halfway covenant. He especially does not like this open communion that is being practiced in the church. And he believed that only those with a clear profession of faith in Jesus Christ should take communion. And so Edwards started to teach against this idea of open communion and make shifts to change that. And his stricter stance clashed with his congregation. Remember, Stoddard had been preaching there for 60 years, and even though it's been 20 years since Stoddard died, he still holds tremendous sway over this congregation, and Edwards ran afoul with that congregation because of this. So in 1750, Edwards was dismissed from his Northampton pastorate in a vote of 230 to 23. So a very resounding kicking out the door of Jonathan Edwards by his congregation. Now, his final sermon was on 2 Corinthians 1:14, and he, at the end of that sermon, pleads with his congregation. He says, "I pray God to pity you and take care of you and provide for you the best means for the good of your souls, and that God himself would undertake for you to be your heavenly Father and the mighty Redeemer of your immortal souls. Do not neglect to pray for yourselves. Take heed you be not of the number of those who cast off fear and restrain prayer before God. Constantly pray to God in secret, and often remember that great day when you must appear before the judgment seat of Christ and meet your minister there, who has so often counseled and warned you." So at age 46, Jonathan Edwards was left without any financial means of supporting his very large family. He wrote, "I am now, as it were, thrown upon the whole wide ocean of the world, and know not what will become of me and my numerous chargeable family." So a very difficult time in Edwards' life here, and the remarkable thing is, he's been fired from this church, and now Northampton finds itself without a pastor, and without someone to fill the pulpit week in and week out, and he was actually asked to preach most weeks for the next several months, and he did, despite all the things that took place. Well, after about a year, he takes up a new call to become pastor of a small church of about 12 families in Stockbridge. This is about 40 miles away, and this is in 1751. Now, his interest in taking up this role was primarily there was an opportunity to minister to the Native Americans in that area. There was a school set up for the Native children. And there's some challenges, though, here as well as he gets into his role as their pastor. Members of the Williams family live in Stockbridge too, And they're of the same mind as the Northampton Williams family, and they oppose Edwards at every turn. But after 3 years of this, they actually pack up and leave. The natives loved him, the other people loved him dearly, and so they just didn't get any headway in trying to stir up trouble for Jonathan Edwards. Now, despite them leaving, he faced other problems. There was financial problems at this time, and they're also on the verge of war. The French and Indian War broke out in 1755. It was a very dangerous time to be living in Stockbridge. Again, remember, a lot of these towns are frontier towns. They're on the edge of the wilderness, and that war very much impacted the area of Stockbridge. One of his daughters would visit them and write later about how she feared for her parents and how dangerous it was to be living there. Now, one of Jonathan and Sarah's daughters, Esther, was married to a man by the name of Aaron Burr Sr., the president of the College of New Jersey at Princeton. Now, this is Aaron Burr Sr., not the Aaron Burr that you might be thinking of. Now, it's his son, Aaron Burr Jr., who would become the third vice president of the United States and famously the man who shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Aaron Burr Sr. would die in 1757, and Jonathan Edwards would be called and invited to take up his post as president of what would become known as Princeton. Now, he tried to turn this down. He wrote a letter about how he's not suited to this kind of work, how he's not a healthy man, how he's very busy writing, how he's pastoring here in Stockbridge and doesn't want to leave. But they keep asking him, and he ultimately puts the decision in the hands of some trusted people in the Ministers Association that he's a part of, and they recommend that he take this position. And he does. However, he would not get a chance to serve long. He was president of Princeton for about 35 days. There's smallpox ravaging the area, and Edwards wanted to encourage other people to take an inoculation and took one himself. Well, through that he contracted the virus, and it appeared in his mouth and in his throat, made it impossible for him to eat or to drink, or had great difficulty speaking, and ultimately he would die from that of starvation and dehydration. He died on March 22nd, 1758. His daughter Lucy was there to minister to him and to nurse him in his final days, and they recorded his last words to her. He said, "Dear Lucy, it seems to me to be the will of God that I must shortly leave you, and therefore give my kindest love to my dear wife, and tell her that the uncommon union that has so long subsisted between us has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual, and therefore will continue forever. And I hope she will be supported under so great a trial, and submit cheerfully to the will of God. And as to my children, you are now like to be left fatherless, which I hope will be an inducement to you all to seek a father who will never fail you." Now, tragically, Esther would die just 16 days later, and then Sarah, Jonathan Edwards' wife, would rush down to take care of her 2 newly orphaned grandchildren. Sarah would also die in October of that year. So a tragic end to the life of Jonathan Edwards that was really remarkable in many ways. Jonathan Edwards' legacy was one of faithful service in the midst of difficulties, careful theological precision during a time of great revival, and he left behind a library of helpful theological works and sermons that continue to help believers today. Jonathan Edwards' life was marked by deep devotion, intellectual brilliance, and unwavering commitment to the truth. And he was not without his hardships and his controversies, but his impact was truly great. As a pastor, theologian, writer, and missionary, his influence shaped the Great Awakening and continues to impact believers in our own day. Though his time on earth was short, his legacy endures, and it's a reminder that faithfulness in ministry, even in the face of opposition, leaves a lasting mark for generations to come. I hope you enjoyed this brief look at the life and ministry of Jonathan Edwards. We'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and, more importantly, sharing this video with a friend who you think would get something out of it. You can find additional resources at reasonabletheology.org.